Salutations! Today I shall be your teacher, Sin Tzu. That's right, I barely tried. Before I begin, I would like to start with a couple notes. First, I learned that drinking water and proper hydration help with accidental ASMR mouth noises. After learning this, I promptly spent 17 minutes under a faucet trying to make sure that I drank as much water as possible. I'm sure it was worth it, especially the weird expressions my dog was giving me. Second, I would like to point out my TA. I had an art friend make this little goober for me. Follow his points, follow his eye, and you shall be led to a new world. Anyway, have you been looking at your imperial peasants and thinking that you are tired of leading and you want to be one of them? Well, that is a terrible idea. Forget it right now. Do you really want to be this man? Look at his face. What does he think about? All he thinks about is bread, and the fact that that is all he has had for the last 3 weeks that he has been under your service. And to these protests, asking for more food, I say no. Instead, you want to be this gentleman over here, this Chad, this utter superior piece of humanity. And what makes him so superior? Probably his giant shaft of his axe. And in this breakdown, I will try to describe exactly what this does for him, other than making his Tinder profile much more successful than yours. In this, I will assume that you have a rough, basic understanding of the principles of Bannerlord combat. You know, the pointy end goes into the other guy. To begin, we have 3 overarching classes of melee weapons: one-handed, two-handed, and polearms. Now, it's more complicated than that exactly, but to describe these, you have the sword and shield build, the giant sword, and the big pokey stick. Frankly, I think that all of these are viable and depend on playstyle. Except for the polearm. Seriously, if you use that and get captured 69 times, like I know you have, don't. I'm not going to reimburse you, I'm sorry. Overall, these weapons further break into various categories themselves, but first we should describe weapon damage. There are 3 kinds of damage you can inflict: cutting, piercing, and blunt. This is just 5e D&D, isn't it? Anyway, those 3 damages occur in their own fairly obvious ways: cutting damage from slashing, piercing from stabbing, and blunt from non-bladed weapons. In general, cutting damage is the highest, followed by piercing and then blunt. Where things get complicated, however, is in armor deflection. Using an equation that could probably send a chimp to the moon, or at least an equation complicated enough to make my monkey brain want to leave the planet, the 3 damage types interact with armor values differently. Blunt damage ignores the most armor, followed by piercing, then cutting. This means that you want to use blunt damage against higher armor targets and cutting against lower armor. I also assume that blunt damage has a higher chance of taking a prisoner. I'm not sure, and I'm really not kinky enough to test this kind of thing out. Now we can describe the fighting styles a bit. One-handed weapons tend to attack fast and give you the option to carry a shield. This is great, as blocking is much easier with the shield, and shields can take shots like your mom did last night. The shield, however, has durability and will break, although it magically gets repaired after the fight. Somehow. I guess you just have a little bag wizard that welds the splinters back into a shield. It's beyond my pay grade. Anyway, the biggest downside of one-handed fighting is that the damage is pathetic. You will be very tanky, but it'll feel like you're trying to mine obsidian with a wood pick. You also have gross vulnerability periods when you swing to attack. That being said, a shield is still a shield, and you'll at least greatly reduce damage if you can create collision with an attack, but you'll still be open to range fire. Overall, 10 out of 10. And if you want to be a little bitch boy hiding behind his men, telling them to fight the big scary sturgeon. Two-handed weapons, however, are where boys become men. Unfortunately, I am still very much a boy. The big appeal of two-handed weapons is that they do much more damage, can demolish shields faster, have a greater reach, and can cleave through multiple enemies at once. You also will have an extra weapon slot, as you have no ability to use a shield to begin with. That being said, they swing slower, they handle worse, and you better get really good at the blocking system or you'll end up with more holes than my ego. At the topic of my ego, why don't you go like and forget it. This feels cringy even just saying it. I have in the script not to say it, but you know, I thought better than me when I wrote the script. I thought I was smarter than that me, and you know, I just forget it. The biggest issue of two-handed weapons is also in the fact that you absolutely cannot block ranged weapons. I mean, go on. Seriously, try it. Go grab a friend and have him throw rocks at you while you swing a big stick. But don't do that. That's a bad idea. But there's a whole Mythbusters episode dedicated to the idea of blocking arrows with a sword, and it just doesn't happen. It only happens in anime and movies, I'm sorry. This does, however, create a bit of an issue of style, you see. You can either play as the armored knight who can take the shots anyway, or you can play as the ripped, barely covered hunk showing off the size of his eggplant as he slashes enlisted peasants who are probably barely adults in half. The last weapon style would be polearms. These are the big pointy sticks, and that's really all there is to them. The biggest note here is that you can only stab with these, a high stab or a low stab. This means that they will exclusively deal piercing damage, which is really up to you on how you feel about it. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. Meanwhile, their biggest advantage is in the sheer range, which is the greatest of all melee weapons. This is a bit of a problem though, as you will have major issues handling any enemy that manages to get close up to you. This, however, brings us to a perfect segue into weapon types. For polearms, you really only have two options, which oddly reflect the one-handed and two-handed weapons otherwise in place. You can choose to have a shorter spear with a shield and fight like a Spartan. Nothing wrong with this though. A shield to catch arrows and a shorter spear for closer quarters, plus you can use the shield to help you bat away close enemies to get them back into spear range. You also can use a two-handed spear, a pike or a lance. A lance is designed for horse combat. You might be able to use a shield too, but that's kind of besides the point. The real benefit of lances, besides them being longer, is in the fact that you can couch them. It's spelled couch, but the English language... This essentially means that you can joust with them. This allows you to charge into the enemy weapon first, dealing extra damage, and then following it up with the horse trample damage as you go through several enemies. This is devastating when done properly, but can be difficult as you need a horse in a relatively straight line to run. This is also pretty much exactly what you see with the ideal perfect cavalry charge. But anyway, a pike, however, is designed for foot troops. This is also very long, but best of all, it can be braced. This mechanic isn't used much because it can be kind of difficult to set up to be practical, at least en masse with multiple troops. But if done properly, it can be a massive anti-cavalry weapon that can basically nullify cav charges. One-handed and two-handed weapons basically have the same weapon types with each other. You primarily have swords, axes, and maces. You also have daggers, curved swords, and whatnot, but frankly those aren't all that important. Just look at the stat differences to a sword and choose what you prefer. A sword is the base weapon that has the fastest general attack speed and handling. It also has the ability to cut and pierce if you choose to stab with it instead. An axe has no such choice, as you will only be slashing with this thing. It has a slower attack speed and worse handling compared to a sword, but deals more damage. This damage difference is even more stark when you compare their two-handed variants, especially when the two-handed axe will cleave through multiple targets easier. Axes also tend to deal more damage against shields, breaking them faster. Maces and other blunt weapons tend to vary a bit. They function similarly to an axe, just using blunt damage instead. Ultimately, the choices between the various blunt weapons should probably be based on stat comparisons. And that's pretty much the gist of it. While I still say there is merit to all weapon types except for polearms, there are definitely choices that fit different playstyles. Overall, I would try to choose an archetype of what you want to become as a fighter. Do you want to be tanky, a brute, or more of a shock cavalry? It also doesn't hurt to mix these weapon types up a bit, as you do have 4 weapon slots for your character after all. If you want my personal opinion, I play as a sword and shield boy who likes to get in with a shield wall. The combat is chaotic, and I kinda like that. I try to leverage the sword's extra attack speed to slightly stun-lock the enemy when I hit them and follow up the advantage. That's just me though, and I'd recommend you play around a bit, learn different things, and really find what you have fun with. It is a bit of a sandbox game after all, meant for you to make choices off your own inclinations and preferences. But let's be honest, the end game here is to just charge through a bunch of peasants shouting bloody murder at the top of your lungs, slashing left and right, having as much fun as you can as they fall before you in piles of blood.